Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for coming and coming in such numbers. And obviously, in advance, thanks to all our panelists for giving their time to be here today. My name is Stephen Kinsella. I'm the chair of trustees of the Press Justice Project, which is hosting this event. And I should, of course, actually also thank Lewis Silkin. I'd hoped that Adam Glass might be here, but very kind of them to make their lovely premises available to us. But the PJP, the Press Justice Project, is a new organisation, a new charity. We were only set up 2 years ago. And essentially, we work alongside Hacked Off, which many of you will be familiar with. Hacked Off tends to focus much more on the campaigning side. And we, although working very closely with them on all aspects, we focus on looking after victims of press intrusion. And we had the idea when we set up to start running, because obviously there's huge interest in particular among the legal profession in what we do. So in addition to our other activities, we organise these seminars with a particular legal focus. And this is our fourth. We started doing thematic ones. So our last one was on sports people and the press. And probably our next one next year will be on relations between the press and the police. So I think there'll be a little bit to talk about there as well. Because we are a charity, it does mean that any money that is donated to us, including in the ticket price, can benefit from a 20% uplift for those of you who are UK taxpayers. So that's another of the benefits of having a charity to work alongside Hacked On. Now, as you've seen from the running order, we have 4 panels. We'll have 2 today, 45 minutes each, followed by a tea break, and then another 2, and then finishing at 7 with drinks, again, kindly provided by Lewis Silkin. I've let all the chairs know that they need to be very strict on timing, so each panel has 45 minutes. I've obviously been lobbied about that. I've said, yes, I know you've got great speakers, I know you'll have lots of questions, but there will be time for us milling around afterwards, in the breaks and after, to follow up with individual questions if we have them for panelists, if we can drag them aside. And finally, I have to note today, and Nathan remarked on this to me as well, I'll introduce Nathan to you later, but it's quite interesting to be running a session on relations between politicians and the media at a time when one of the most powerful politicians in the world is launched a completely ridiculous lawsuit against our national broadcaster to try and cow it, which is obviously a tactic used by many on certain fringes of our politics, both in Europe and in the US. Now, I'm probably going to invite our panelists, if they have time, to think about what that case would look like if it were brought in the UK. Would, apart from the fact that I think it's out of time, would Trump actually have a case that he really could bring for loss of reputation on the basis of what was, and clearly the clip was very badly botched, but has it really harmed his reputation? Of course, we understand he's going to be bringing the case in Florida. So as an example of lawfare with a transatlantic element, again, they might have views on that, about whether he'll prevail and what it might mean. So with that, I'm very happy to kick this off. I'm going to hand it over to Gerald Shamash, Lord Shamash, Gerald to most of us, a long-standing friend and great supporter of press freedom, but has done a huge amount of work advising the Labour Party, so probably knows as much about relations between the media and politicians as anybody in this room. But Gerald will take over to introduce the subject of his panel and his fellow panelists. So thank you, Gerald.
Thank you, Steve. Right. Good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great, that's good. First of all, can I thank Lewis Silkin again for the hospitality and the venue, which is wonderful. I'm here because I have done a lot of work with politics and politicians over the God knows how many decades, and it's a very interesting world to be in, and to try and get the balance between the law and the politics. And you've got somebody, I think the way I describe it is politicians, they have thick skins or thin skins, and the thin skins ones are with a very small majority, and the thick skins are the ones who actually, you know, you're one 18,000 majority, don't really care that much. But the thin skins, every single thing is really important to them. And those are the ones often that find their way, or did find their way, to my door. I was also involved with the cash for peerages case that many may remember, and the parliamentary expenses. So what the plan is today is I'll introduce the 2 rising stars. Actually, they've stopped rising, they're just stars now. And this is Godwin Busuttil from 5 Raymond Buildings, and Ian Helme from Matrix Chambers. They're going to talk for about 10-15 minutes each, and then we'll take questions. I really want to encourage all of you to ask the questions of our panelists. I've got 2 or 3 to get going, but let's start with them. So over to Godwin, who I believe is going first. And thank you again, everybody, for coming. Press Justice Project's a fantastic thing. To have got this after 2 years is wonderful. And I hope that the founder, John Shepherd, will turn up later, because I want to blag a good, high-quality breakfast out of him.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to turn this up because I think I'm doubling up on mics here, which will have a terrible impact. Okay. So I'm going to talk about, can you hear me okay? Yeah. So I'm going to talk about politicians and the public interest in the context of libel law. And since, as I think it was H.L. Mencken once said, the correct relationship of a journalist to a politician should be that of a dog to a lamppost, it's not surprising that many libel cases have been generated over the years. So the first thing I'm going to say is, what do these people have in common?
Sorry, I'm not walking out, don't worry.
Winston Churchill, Harold Wilson, Geoffrey Archer, Norman Tebbit, John Major, Jonathan Aiken, Neil Hamilton, Andrew Mitchell, George Galloway, Dominic Raab, Liam Fox, Tinio, Anna Turley, and Andrew Bridgen. Any guesses what all those people have in common? Well, even Anna Turley.
No, pass.
Okay. Right. They're all high-profile politicians who famously brought libel proceedings against other people with somewhat mixed results. But of all of them, to the best of my knowledge, the only one who secured a libel apology after he was dead was Winston Churchill. But he was always a one-off. I mean, I won't bore you with how that happened. But it is true. All right. So the overarching question is, how does the law of libel, good Lord, it's got something wrong there. How does the law approach claims brought by politicians as opposed to anyone else to protect or vindicate their reputation? And how does the public interest, in inverted commas, inform that approach? Well, I'm going to start, given that we don't have a lot of time today, by answering my own question before descending into as much detail or as little detail as time allows. My answer is, to most intents and purposes, politicians in this country are pretty much in the same position as the rest of us when it comes to their right to seek the court's intervention to protect their reputation. Unlike, for example, in America, where they have the Sullivan Rule, which basically means that any public figures, including politicians, have to prove express malice if they want to bring a libel claim, which means that they have to prove in any case over there that the publisher was dishonest in what it published. Here we don't have that. We now have serious harm requirement under the 2013 Act and the defence of public interest also under the 2013 Act, which I'm going to come on to later, but there isn't a sort of overarching principle that politicians or any other public figures in this country are in a worse position to start off with. So as a starting point, to adopt the language of the European Convention of Human Rights, everyone has a right to protection from unnecessary and disproportionate attacks on their reputation as an aspect of their Article 8 right to respect for private and family life, just as everyone has a right to freedom of expression. However, when it comes to balancing that right against other considerations, the scales are in practice likely rapidly to become tipped against the politician. Politicians have a public, elected and privileged lawmaking status, which the rest of us don't enjoy. For example, they have an absolute privilege in respect of everything they say in Parliament. They can say whatever they like, they can't be sued for libel. And unlike us, the rest of us, they also have direct access to the mass media if they want to get some information out there, for example, to meet a criticism that's being made of them. I think we would all, and I should also say that it's important that the press has a reporting privilege too, the privilege to report subject to malice of anything that is said in Parliament. So, in other words, they are in a privileged position for those reasons. I think we would all agree that it is an ordinary incident of this privileged status that politicians will and should be the subject of searching, scrutiny and criticism in the media and more generally, which will often be defamatory of them. And to some extent, policy and the law regard this as right and proper in the public interest, resulting in practical terms in an abridgment of their right to complain and libel. So in various ways, as I will explain, libel law expects politicians to have broader shoulders and thicker skin than those of us who do not inhabit Parliament. So under these circumstances, politicians will usually be better advised to respond directly to defamatory allegations against them in the public arena by putting out their side of the story in the form of properly researched, accurate facts. Yes, I'm thinking of you, Rachel Reeves, not by means of a libel action in court. In my view, libel proceedings by politicians should really only ever be contemplated as an absolutely last resort, reserved for the most serious, demonstrably unfounded allegations, which when the publisher simply will not play ball. Before we go any further, given that the phrase "the public interest" features in the title of this talk, I should perhaps have a go at defining what it is. In the libel law context, essentially it boils down to this: whether the court, after carrying out an objective evaluation of all the circumstances of a publication, what was said, who was the publication made to, based on what source materials, regard it as in the interest of society overall for the publication to have been made, regardless of whether it was true or false. To use European Convention language, the issue is one of whether the publication contributes to a debate of general or public interest in a democratic society. The social or policy imperative is the free flow of information, in this case to voters, so that they can take informed decisions about who they might want to elect. We are not talking here about Lady Hale and the Jamil cases, vapid tittle-tattle about the activities of footballers' wives and girlfriends, which interest large sections of the public, but no one could claim any real public interest in our being told about it. We're talking about the serious stuff. This may extend to see again Lady Hale, this time in the Naomi Campbell case, revealing information about public figures, especially those in elective office, which would otherwise be private, but is relevant to their participation in public life. So bear in mind here that private information can also be defamatory information. There's an overlap. I mean, the categories aren't sealed. The European Court of Human Rights is fairly militant on this point. And since this is supposed to be an update, this is hot off the presses, 21st of October, case of Mortensen and Denmark in the European Court, in which it was held that the conviction of an individual for calling a politician a Nazi on Twitter violated his Article 10 rights. And the court there said last month, there is little scope under Article 10.2 of the Convention for restrictions on freedom of expression in two fields, namely political speech and matters of public interest. A degree of hostility and the potential seriousness of certain remarks do not obviate the right to a high level of protection given the existence of a matter of public interest. And the court also said that for public figures, the limits of critical comment are wider as they are inevitably and knowingly exposed to public scrutiny and must therefore display a particularly high degree of tolerance. So in other words, the whole prism through which European convention law and by extension our law sees things as politicians should expect to put up with a lot more criticism than the rest of us. And that informs how libel law works in the contemplation of every issue in an individual case involving a politician. However, it's not as though the truth or falsity of the information, however serious its subject matter, is irrelevant. The public interest in the free flow of political information needs to be set against other competing public interests. The public interest in the preservation of good public reputations and in the public being provided with true information, not false. When the court decides in a specific case, on a specific issue even, how the balance ought to be struck between a politician's right to protect his or her reputation and freedom of expression with a view to determining whether their claim should prevail or not. It is obviously not in the public interest widely to disseminate seriously damaging falsehoods. whatever the nature of the damage is, or whoever suffers it. Yeah, I'm going to give you Lord Holpass's quote from Reynolds. I might as well. It is important always, so this is Lord Holpass in the seminal case really about politicians, which informed the original public interest defence as framed by the House of Lords in the Reynolds case, which involved the Taoiseach of Ireland, Albert Reynolds, and in turn informed what is now the Section 4 public interest defence in the Defamation Act. And what Lord Holpass said in that case was, it is important always to remember that it is the communication of information, not misinformation, which is the subject of the liberty of free expression. There is no human right to disseminate information that is not true. No public interest is served by publishing or communicating misinformation. The working of a democratic society depends on the members of that society being informed, not misinformed. Misleading people and purveying as facts statements which are not true is destructive of the democratic society and should form no part of such a society. There is no duty to publish what is not true. There is no interest in being misinformed. These are general propositions going far beyond the mere protection of reputations. Amen to that. This seems all the more true and important in current times than it was in 1999 when Reynolds was decided. Question bubbling under the surface of any libel action, but especially where the publication is for serious political character, is to what extent should misinformation and the damage it may cause be tolerated as the price of free speech? But in more practical terms and briefly, and I'm going to do this briefly, the issues arising in a libel action where the status of a claimant as a politician may have a significant impact on how the court goes about evaluating his or her claim, where in each instance the claimant is to be expected to have broader shoulders and thicker skin, are first, in ascertaining whether words are to be characterized as defamatory in the first place. So that's using the old definition before the serious harm requirement was brought in, whether the words are likely to lower the standing of the claimant in a serious way. And I think it's probably in that in a serious way bit where the status of the politician, status of the claimant as a politician may come into play, because I think if it's a libel concerning his or her private life, it's more likely to be serious than something which simply goes to the way they're conducting their professional business as an MP. The next issue where it is also likely to have a role to play, and it's really the same point, is this is now a requirement of every libel claim that's brought. A statement is not defamatory at all and therefore not actionable unless its publication has caused or is likely to cause serious harm to the reputation of the claimant. Okay, so that requires you to focus in to some degree at least on who the claimant is, what they're complaining about, and is there any real damage going to be done, serious damage? Because if not, then it doesn't get to first base. There's no claim. The next area where it is likely to have a significant impact is in Section 4, which is the public interest defence, which grew out of Reynolds or was informed by Reynolds. And the Reynolds criteria, as they're called, still have a role to play. The basic requirement is the defendant has to show to establish this defence that reasonably publishing the statement was in the public interest. Well, I mean, clearly, if it's something that's about a politician or political matters, it's more likely that requirement is going to be satisfied. But I mean, obviously, it informs every aspect. It's just the court has basically decided it's going to be satisfied in almost any case. I mean, there's basically no content to A, unless it was a completely private matter. The court said it's of the public interest. It's the second bit that matters. And the status of the claim is going to go to whether it was in the, whether there was a proper belief that publishing was in the public interest, and also whether that belief was reasonable. I mean, I should point out that Anna Turley, who we mentioned already, who's now a minister without portfolio and a member of the cabinet, successfully saw off a Section 4 defence in her libel claim in 2019 against Unite the Union. So, I mean, it's not impossible that it's not going to be that every politician is going to be doomed to fail because of this. Anyway, and then the final area in which it might have an impact is on the quantum of damages if the case gets that far. And as Mr. Justice Warby said in the Baron and Vines case, which concerned allegations that Labour MPs had known about large-scale sexual abuse of young girls and Rotherham and done nothing about it, what he said in that case is special caution is required when it comes to deciding what is justified and proportionate by way of compensation for libels, such as those in issue here, which are published by one politician about another on a topic of public interest. Politicians in general have thicker skins than average. Whether or not that is so in the individual case, they are expected to tolerate much more than would be expected of others. So that's it.
Thank you very much, Godwin. Thank you, everyone. I'm now going to do a breezy tour of updates in relation to misuse of private information. Three parts of this. Firstly, looking at restatements of the law from this year after ZXC, and that's the seminal privacy case that established that you have a reasonable expectation of privacy in relation to a police investigation. Perhaps a surprising result, but one that is now cemented in the law. I'm going to look in a bit more detail about what public interest means, again looking at some recent cases, and then a bit of wider context. Just briefly going to touch on public interest statements in relation to the law of harassment and breach of confidence, and see how they interact. This is the case of Abassi. This is not really about privacy law. This is about injunctions. But the Supreme Court took the opportunity to restate again the law as stated in Abassi. So this is from this year. So this is generally what we go to now when looking at the law of privacy. And you see that the two-stage test. Ask first whether the information is private. And then secondly, if it is private, the next question is whether it's been used by the defendant in a way which constitutes an infringement of the claimant's right to privacy. I'll just have a look at the last sentence, because the last sentence is quite interesting, something we come on to. That explains that guidance can be found in a rapidly growing body of domestic legal precedent, as well as in development in other jurisdictions which share our common law tradition and in the jurisprudence of the European Court. And I'll come back to that last bit about the European Court. So that's Abassi. There are two first instance decisions where that's restated. I don't need to show you these. One is from this year, one is HXZ, and the other is AXB. We're back into alphabet soup territory. Don't try and keep a track. I lost track a long time ago. But they're first instance decisions. They're not about politicians, but they restate the test. The other one I just wanted to show you, I see your October 2025, and I raise you the 10th of November this year, so I'm very hot off the press. And this is an extrajudicial speech by Lord Briggs. Now, what's interesting in this context is you can see from the title, protecting human rights, the common law as the starting point. And this is part of the ongoing sort of judicial project to cement human rights as being based in the common law. And this is in part, quite overtly in this speech, a reaction to the political circumstances suggesting there may at some point be a repeal of the Human Rights Act or withdrawal from the convention. So there's been an ongoing judicial project to say, well, either that doesn't matter or, you know, Yabu sucks. And saying that these rights are all part of the common law, whether they were or they weren't in the first place. And this is, Lord Briggs gives privacy as an example where effectively the HRA has done its work. These are now, in a positive way, the right to privacy is now grounded in the common law, even if you got rid of the HRA and the convention. So bearing in mind the Abassi judgment, which says we do look at convention for how the law works in practice, this is looking at it from the other angle and saying, well, we can get the same result in the common law. So it's just an interesting counterpoint, those two things from this year. Looking at the first stage as the two-stage test, whether there is a reasonable expectation of privacy and the things that might be relevant to politicians in particular, you do have to look at the attributes of the claimant, so who you are as a claimant matters. Perhaps surprisingly, a person's political opinions and affiliations are identified as something which will normally be regarded as private. Don't worry, we're not all missing a trick that all politicians can sue whenever their political views are stated. That's more about private beliefs and opinions. I'm also not sure that's actually right. I traced it back in the footnotes, and it comes from a concession from a non-specialist junior counsel in a case. I think that might be going a little bit too far. Whether it's right or not will come out in due course, and it's now got the sort of imprimatur of the Supreme Court in ZXC, so it's sort of there. On the other hand, a person's misperformance of a public role is normally not private. Again, that makes sense. It's a criticism of something they themselves have done. And criminal conduct is very complicated. It's outside the scope of me being able to say something detailed and meaningful about it today. But if the allegation is that you have broken a law, there's a criminal investigation into what you're doing, that may or may not be private, depending on the full circumstances. So that's one where I think specialist advice on the facts is going to be necessary. Second stage, this is an all the circumstances test, so everything goes in the mix. The extent to which publication is in the public interest is of central importance. It's talked about as the initial essential criterion, and then you've got some what we call the Axel Springer factors in stage 2. It's Murray factors stage 1, Axel Springer stage 2, and again I've just pulled out some that are relevant to politicians: how well known the person is, what this was about, their prior conduct, and the content, form, and consequences of publication. And the next slide, I've just sort of pulled out from the European authorities, bearing in mind what was said in Abbasi and previously in ZXC, some of the principles. Oh no, sorry. First, we've got a summary of what the second stage is. You don't look at generalities when you're talking about public interest. You really need to bore down into what public interest in relation to this publication and balance it against your Article 8 rights, your reasonable expectation of privacy. So you can't just say, oh, this is generally in the public interest. The courts want you to do a lot more than that. And again, that's the best quote I've got on that from Driver, not from this year, but it's the best quote I know that shows what you have to do in practice. And then these are the factors I pulled out of the Strasbourg authorities about the principles that are most relevant to politicians. Firstly, and this is a similar principle to that identified by Godwin, little scope for restrictions on political speech, on debate on questions of public interest. Political expression is very broad, so I wouldn't get hung up on whether it's specifically about a politician or not. It's a much broader concept than that. So I've seen it invoked in a lot of different circumstances where it's not strictly sort of politics, certainly not with a capital P. Public interest for political figures may extend to aspects of their private life. This is something that's often missed. People often think, oh, well, even if it's a politician, if it's about something that is not to do with their public role, it's still private. It's a little grayer than that when it comes to politicians, because there are quite a few situations where you can argue that even though it's prima facie private, it does have an impact on their public role. And I know media in particular are keen on those sorts of arguments about widening what they can and can't publish. And then in a political context, essentially, it's not quite open season on language, but you get away with a lot more in terms of your manner of expression when something's identified as political speech. There are some limitations, though, and then these are sort of, again, some of the relevant limitations. It's not absolute. Restrictions may be imposed to ensure that the conduct of public life at government level, including public debate, does not fall below a minimum level so as to endanger public confidence in democracy. It can be necessary to protect people from offensive and abusive verbal attacks. And public servants who aren't politicians, there are also the wider limits of acceptable criticism, but not as wide as it is for politicians. So those are some principles we can sort of draw out from the authorities. I've got no new sort of 2025 political privacy cases for you, unfortunately. What I do have is a statement of principle from a harassment case. And it says, any attempt to interfere with political speech requires the most convincing justification and the most anxious scrutiny from the court. Now, between this case, Curtin, Hourani and Hibbert, that's Lord Justice Warby, Mr. Justice Nicklin and Mrs. Justice Stay. Now, they are the present and former judges in charge of the Media and Communications list. So they're essentially the people in charge of determining these issues in the High Court. And the reasoning by which they get there is not just applicable to harassment, it's applicable across the board when you're balancing Article 8 and 10. So I think this is something to be aware of, is that the judges currently, who were recently in charge and are now in charge in this area, have a very sort of, will require any attempt to restrict political speech to be subject to a very scrutiny. So that's why I've put that up there, even though it's harassment. Breach of confidence. Now, there's a slightly different public interest test in breach of confidence, as I'm sure you all know. The test there isn't just about doing balancing. You've got to ask whether it's in the public interest to breach the confidence as well. So that's a separate element of the test that you always have to think of. And breach of confidence does give you an alternative way to get home if you're concerned in privacy. So if you can frame your cause of action as breach of confidence, it's harder to meet the public interest test in that cause of action. The case I gave you there was the Prince of Wales case. And just to come back to politics, there was an example given in that case. It described it as an extreme example where the content of a budget speech is leaked. And it says that's of great importance, but it says if a disloyal typist were to seek to sell that to a newspaper in advance of the delivery of speech, and the court says there's no doubt the newspaper would be in breach of duty of confidence if it purchased and published that speach. Now, this is 20 years ago that this was said, almost 20 years ago. It's a sign of how long I've been doing this. Made me feel old when I realised that. And I'm going to end this with a question to everyone. Do we think that that example would still hold good today?
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
You're on mic.
You're on mic.
You're on mic.
Yeah.
Thank you, Godwin, and thank you, Ian, again for that very interesting talk and great help having the very good slides. So I've got a couple of questions, but I'd rather open it up for you. Can I invite questions? Come on, guys. I mean, ridiculous. All right, here we go. I'll try mine. I was surprised that social media, unofficial leaks, and citizen journalism complicated the traditional legal framework for determining public interest in political reporting.
No, it's all right. I'm just having a think.
Oh, am I?
Well, okay. Here's one observation.
I'm sorry. Sorry.
So clearly, I mean, also I think probably the biggest change in the years I've been practicing is when I first started, every libel action was pretty much about, almost every libel action was from the person suing the mainstream legacy media. These days, most of the claims that come across my desk are good or bad, relate to people hassling each other online and specifically on social media. And the laws kind of had to respond to that. And the most concrete way I could think of just off the top of my head, having had a look at that Section 4 defence, which, I mean, just in case you hadn't noticed, the thing about the Section 4 defence is you've got a complete defence of libel action, even if you can't prove that what you've written is true. Okay? You've got a complete defence if you can prove that you reasonably believe it was in the public interest to publish what you did. Okay? I mean, that's a very important point, because I think most people think, I mean, most people on the street think that if someone has said something which is a libel, you'd have to prove it's true. You don't. You know, you can just prove that and you've got a complete defence. So the point about social media and, you know, citizen journalism and all the rest of it is that I think the court appreciates that it has to apply, it has to vary the standard that applies to that question of reason to believe it was in the public interest to fit whoever it is that's doing the reporting. I mean, it's not that, I mean, it is effectively Section 4, although the court would deny this, is setting a sort of normative standard. But like in any sort of no negligence or negligence case, it's got to sort of say, well, I mean, who are we talking about here? You know, how many people is it going to? How much damage is it likely to have done? You know, if it's only two, if the court says, well, it might have caused serious harm to reputation because it was published to 1,000 people, it doesn't follow from that they're going to apply the same standard to Mr. Bloggins, the blogger, as they are to the BBC.
Yeah, and then I think Stephen won.
So two answers, one legal, one practical. Legally, there's no defence of journalism, as it were. The defence in Section 4 of sort of responsible publication, public interest publication, is the same whoever you are. There's no sort of threshold. You don't have to be a card-carrying journalist, remember the media, nothing like that. It is the same. I was involved in a case back in 2008. Which went to, or may have been later, which went to the Court of Appeal, where they said that despite that, what is reasonable depends on the circumstances, including who you are and what you do. So what is required in all the circumstances to be reasonable depends on who you are. And that includes whether you are a journalist or a citizen blogger. So it does take it into account in that second stage, as Godwin said, and there is authority on that. The second point I want to make is a practical one. Now, back in the day, as you say, when we were suing newspapers, that's great. You could sue a newspaper, you had one person you were fighting against, and you could get an apology and the whole world knew about it, and that's fine. That's a really nice way of vindicating your reputation. It was straightforward. Now, you're fighting an ecosystem which is totally fragmented, and you could have decide you want to sue someone over an allegation somewhere, it goes somewhere else, and trying to fight that is incredibly difficult. So one of the first things when anyone comes and says, oh, I want to sue over these allegations, is to work out, well, even if you have a good cause of action, what's the point? I mean, is there a point in doing this? Is there a way to secure vindication? Because winning sometimes isn't enough. You really do need to have a practical way of securing your vindication. And that's a lot harder today than it was 20 years ago.
Thanks, Ian. Any questions? The lady there, and then we'll take Stephen.
I was just going to ask. I was just going to ask about the concerns surrounding AI now and doctored images. Like, I know that the law still stands on things like that and replicated images. It's not working, is it? But the thing I just wanted to know is, are a lot of conversations being had and brought to you now when it comes to concerns around images? Because if you use the Matt Hancock one, for example, that the Sun did in his office, within a matter of years already now as journalists, you're looking at that image thinking, is that even real? And how can we prove that's real? And has it, is that genuine? I just wondered what's really being thought of in terms of those things as any form of defence now.
Again, I've got two parts to an answer to that. The first, to direct you to the second edition of Matrix's online publication. It's available in all good bookshops. In fact, Ali and Chris are here. And there is a brand new chapter in that called The Law of Artificial Intelligence. And I may or may not have been involved in writing that, but there is an excellent section explaining how
What's the answer?
The answer is it will cost £35. The second issue, and this is relevant to this question of public interest. So you may have noticed that the public interest in privacy is an objective test, whereas the public interest in libel and also probably in data protection is a subjective test. Now, one of the ways in which that difference might matter is in relation to artificial intelligence, because where you have something that is produced solely by a machine, it's difficult to see how there can be any relevant belief relevant to the defence. So I think a defence of public interest is going to be much harder to establish in libel than in any other cause of actions, because you can't form that belief. A machine can't form that belief that is a necessary component of the defence.
Stephen?
Thank you. Yeah, I was just reflecting on Godwin's remarks.
Can you hear it?
Can you hear, or should I stand
Okay.
up? Just on Godwin's remarks that the defendant doesn't have to show that it was true as long as they can show the publication was in the public interest. But what I wondered as a non-libel specialist is, do they also have to at least show that they had a reasonable belief that it was true? And I ask that because I'm thinking of the number of apologies just the Telegraph has had to publish over the last several months. Or was it the Times who rang up the wrong de Blasio to get comments in the Democratic challenges? So there, if a newspaper in particular just doesn't take sufficient care, as they often don't, to make sure that the story is true, is that a problem for them, quite aside from?
Okay, so in the ordinary case, what I mean by the ordinary case is where a newspaper's written something, done an investigation, and is sort of lending its weight to a particular allegation, then it has been held in a couple of cases. I mean, there's a case called Arkham, which I was in, where the court said, unless, in most cases like that, or in cases like that, they will have to show, in order to show they reasonably believed it was in the public interest, they'll have to show that they reasonably believe that it was true, in whatever meaning it was that the court has found. And it gets a bit complicated because they may have thought, or they may said they thought that it was going to mean X, but in fact the court said it meant something more serious, or vice versa. However, the basic idea is, in that kind of case, they will have to show as a condition of proving that defence that they reasonably believed it to be true, whether it turned out to be true or not. And of course, if the only defence in play is a Section 4 defence, the court's never going to address the question of whether it was true or false.
Yeah, do you want to add anything?
I agree with that.
Thank you, Steve. Ian, I was really struck by something you said about the difficulties claimants face now in bringing actions, even when they've got a really good cause of action. What do you think can or should be done, this is to Godwin as well, to enable people to hold to account those who've been defaming them online or publishing private information online?
That's a very good question. Yes, there's a very, it's a very good question that has a sort of complex answer. Part of the problem is not with the law itself, the sort of law of libel and privacy. Part of it is ensuring that there is a healthy online ecosystem that supports positive output, and that is sort of well researched and subject to certain checks and balances. Now, against that, you'd have a lot of people saying, no, the internet should be a free for all. It's all about the democratization of speech. Where, if there is any way in squaring that circle, maintaining everyone's ability to say what they want while protecting individual reputations, it's above my pay grade, I'm afraid. I'm going to have to pass that one on to Godwin.
Can I just follow on that, because it's quite important under election law where you're actually seeking to get people elected. And there is a section of the Representation of the People Act 1983 called Section 106, is where you make a full statement about the character or conduct of a candidate during the period of an election. In the way that, in the world we're living in now, if I put something out on social media that Stephen Kinsella's a thief, the damage is gone. The election's in 2 days' time or 3 days' time. And it's an impossible situation where you can't. In the old days, you used to be able to, I've done it before, getting injunctions where you can go to the court, stop the delivery of leaflets, stop the delivery of campaign letters. But now the damage is done immediately. And it's a discussion we had this morning about it. So I'd like some free legal advice from you two.
I suppose one practical change. So we still have the law of Bonnachadh and Perriman in this jurisdiction, which essentially means it's impossible to get an interim injunction in a libel case unless you can show that what has been published is there is no possible defence. It's an incredibly high standard. Now, there have been noises made by the judiciary that's archaic and outdated, and because you've got reputation as part of Article 8 and free speech is Article 10, there has to be a much more nuanced balancing exercise. That argument failed when it was first tried back in 2006. Mr. Justice Nicklin, who was the judge previously in charge, made noises in a case a couple of years ago that actually it might be ripe for revisiting. So one thing that may happen at some stage is that law could be revisited, and the higher courts could say, actually, no, that law is outdated. The same law should apply for privacy as for defamation, and so it's easier to get interim injunctions. So that's one practical possibility direction the law may go in the next few years.
But it won't work in election cases, is the example I've given.
I mean, well, exactly. In election cases, you already have the law for election cases. It just doesn't work in practice.
But it's very ancient.
Yeah.
Godwin.
Well, I think all I was going to say is that, you know, we're still in the infancy of the internet, but the internet is obviously the biggest, most fundamental social change in the last 30 years. I mean, and you know, the law tends to follow what's going on in the world, not the other way around. And I mean, yeah, I don't want to be sort of pessimistic about it, but I mean, I would suspect that if we carry on with the current culture, and I can't really see how it's going to change, eventually people will say it's a bit like, you know, King Canute. What can we do about this? And it'll just mean that the laws will change to give people fewer protections, I think. I mean, but I mean, that is, you know, we're stuck with it and there's no way of regulating it. Or at least, you know, let's even take just a simple example of the whatever it's called now, the online harm safety. It used to be harm.
Online
And it became safety. I mean, it's pretty toothless. And that's just dealing with a very narrow question of whether young people should be exposed to incredibly dangerous material. But you know, dare I say, the last government bottled it. You know, eventually they just gave in to the power of the tech platforms and tech companies. So, I mean, you know, that's a good example of just in that very narrow area, but clearly there should have been, you know, properly powerful regulation. It didn't happen.
Yeah, that's good. Any more questions? Any hands? Yeah, the gentleman at the back, who I know.
I have to apologise. I wasn't here for the main sessions. I've come from Gerald place of work, but I've got a question that doesn't relate to individuals, to an institution. What advice would you give to BBC lawyers about the suit from Donald Trump? They have until Friday to reply.
Should I do that? Nap off. I'll tell you why, because I mean, there may have been manipulation, but so far as I could see, there was no damage. You know, I mean, I've read and seen enough of this stuff to suggest that there probably is a good defense of truth to the idea that Trump incited violence in January 2022 or whenever it was at the Capitol. Whether they spliced those speeches together or not, they shouldn't have done. That was bloody stupid, right? But I think that so far as I could tell, the substance of what they said was true.
No, I mean, broadly agree. Trump has sued her previously. So he sued a few years ago in the Media and Communications list. And what the cause of action he tried to use was data protection. And the one wrinkle, I mean, I completely agree. In reality, his case is going to be hopeless. But the one wrinkle is that data protection is quite an amorphous cause of action. There's a very long limitation period of 6 years. And you can potentially generally complain when any processing of your data has been unfair, and that the limits of that unfairness and what that means are still being worked out. There's live cases going through the courts at the moment about what being unfair work means. As I say, I think in practice, I agree completely with Godwin. I think the result is a sort of foregone conclusion. But there is just a little wrinkle that means that I wouldn't sort of just, be getting the champagne out now and responding to any letter. I'd just have a little think about the practical ways in which he could try and frame a cause of action that might have a little bit more legs than everyone is expecting.
Excellent. Right. Any last questions? No questions at all. Can I then finish by thanking both our eminent gentlemen, Ian and Godwin. Thank you very much all for being part of this session, and there's more to come, I gather. So thank you. Give a round of
So speaking into it, it wasn't told me that I Yes, I saw this. Excellent.
Well, thank you very much, everyone, for coming today. And thank you especially to our panelists. We've got two former party leaders with us, Baroness Natalie Bennett, who before going into politics wrote for The Times, The Independent, and was editor of Guardian Weekly for several years, became leader of the Green Party in 2012. And since 2019, having since stood down from that post, she's been an active member of the House of Lords. Thank you for being here. And we have Sir Vince Cable, who was MP for Twickenham for a total of 20 years. And during that period, he was a cabinet minister for business innovation and skills during the coalition government from 2010 to 2015, and was leader of the Liberal Democrats from 2017 to 2019. Thank you so much for being here. I think if I start with you, Natalie, if that's all right, what do you think are the biggest flaws with the political media in the UK?
Well, I think the biggest flaw, what I would set out most, is that we have a political media that doesn't just treat politics like a football game. It treats it like a preview of a football game. It's who scored the points today, who's going to score the points tomorrow, who's up, who's down. Does it talk about child poverty? Does it talk about Britain's place in the world, truly looking at depths of international affairs? No, it's all about who's up, who's down. And just to give a historic example of this, in the Brexit referendum, apologies for using the word, sorry about that. But I did an event with David Cameron, Harriet Harman, and Nick Clegg. And all of the media questions were about, which reflected most of the coverage, what did this mean for the Tory party leadership? We were debating supposedly Britain's membership of the EU and all of the consequences we've seen since. And the whole reporting angle was, well, yes, but who's going to be leading the Tory party after what we see as the inevitable result that we haven't understood the country at all? So, you know, people think, oh, all that reporting I've seen on Prime Minister's questions, how depressing it is. I'm not going to get involved in politics, not going to get engaged. I mean, my message very strongly is we need a world where everyone makes politics what they do not have done to them. That means people understanding politics is something they can be engaged in, involved in. And that needs a very different kind of political reporting.
I mean, I just picking up on that. I mean, just over the last 6 months, the welfare rebellion, the stuff about the 2-child poverty cap, all of that seems to be reported in the context of what it means for Prime Minister's leadership rather than sort of policy and the impacts on people. Prince, when back, thinking particularly during your time as party leader, when you would have been under a huge amount of media scrutiny, I'm sure you would have had to sort of try to deliver your message both to print media and to broadcast media. Now, one of the big differences that we talk about at the PJP is that broadcast media, perhaps not always as well as we would like, but it is regulated to some extent independently by Ofcom, and there's no equivalent for most national newspapers. Did you find much of a difference in culture between the two media? What were your kind of...
Nathan, can you speak up? It's very difficult to hear at the back.
Yes, I'll try, yes.
Difference between when I was party leader, the difference between the two. I think, I mean, in the general election, for those who don't remember or who were out of the country at the time, we had the last green surge. And yes, I am really enjoying the current green surge. But the last green surge, our membership quadrupled in about 3 months, and how both print and television media treated us changed suddenly from me just trying to get onto anything I could conceivably possibly get on or get quoted anywhere I could, to the point where I had, I believe, paparazzi outside my window. So it was a sudden, enormous change. But what I found very frustrating all the way through was both sides, both print and TV, it was terribly hard to get them to actually debate issues. I mean, it goes back to what my first point, my first argument. They just wanted to talk about, you know, how many votes are you going to get? How many seats are you going to get? And there's also on both sides a profound lack of understanding of the public, which I think the Brexit referendum in particular, various elections since have really demonstrated. In 2015, the number of journalists who I would say, well, we want to re-nationalise the railways. And they go, oh, that's a bit radical, isn't it? And my response was, well, actually, a majority of Tory voters want to re-nationalise the railways, which means by definition that is not a radical policy. So both sides really, I felt they were stuck in a particular bubble of what I would call the Telegraph Mail bubble, and that extended far beyond that. But what I would say was the surprising thing out of that election campaign was the most serious debates of actual issues that I had anywhere were actually on Sky Television, which was something that really surprised me at the time. We were still with the BBC then, and I'm not trying to beat the BBC up today. They've got quite enough on their plate. But the BBC back then was still putting climate change deniers. And I was still debating climate change deniers because I didn't really have any choice. When it was just total nonsense. And I had a really good discussion with Sky about whether we should think about revitalising the economy and how we build strong local economies built around small independent shops and businesses. And I could never have got that onto the BBC. And it was very frustrating. It was very hard to get any real discussion in the print media. And, you know, the alignment of, particularly as elections getting closer, the alignment of newspapers with parties. I mean, speaking as a former Guardian journalist, I heard the entire gory story about this. There was actually a whole full page on the Guardian at 6 p.m. in the evening about green education policy. Now we have, I'm extremely proud of our education policy. We want to abolish Ofsted, abolish SATs, and have education for life, not just exams. 6 p.m. evening, those of you who work in newspapers will know that's quite late on a daily newspaper. There was a full page and an editor said, oh, we can't play the Green Party up that much, and pulled it. So someone had to find something else to fill in the entire page at 6 p.m. So that the newspapers aligning their allegiances really was a problem.
And what do you think about the controversy around a number of your colleagues presenting programmes on GB News?
I suppose the problem is in the title GB News. If they are claiming to be journalists, claiming to present news, I don't think that's possible. If you call it current affairs and it's a discussion program and it's kind of like we're sitting here now, that's a different, but there's a huge blurring of the line between news and commentary. And, you know, as an old traditional journalist, I mean, you know, I was trained back, you know, I'm 59 years old. I was trained back in the old school by a lovely guy called Clark, who worked on the Cootamundra Herald for 55 years. He started as paperboy, and he was a proper old school journalist. And so one of the things I was taught, and this is never stuck in British journalism, and which I'm disappointed about, I was never allowed to use the word reform, because that would made a value judgment. If the government was going to change something, that's what the government was doing. So I was brought up in that school, and, you know, things have changed a lot since then, but I still want to draw that line between reporting news, facts and commentary.
And you sort of hinted at this already when you mentioned the Guardians. But it seems to us at the PJB, one of the big problems with political reporting is the way newspapers just won't cover certain issues. But it's something that regulation can't do anything about. And I wonder if you have any thoughts and solutions to that issue.
COP30 is the obvious phrase that comes into my mind. There's a major global thing happening at the moment, and outside the Guardian and maybe the Independent, how much have you actually seen coverage of COP30? But I've got an even better example than this, because actually last week there was a COP6, and this is on the Minamata Treaty, which is dealing with mercury poisoning. And I only actually got to know about this because we had a debate in the House on a statutory instrument dealing with the Northern Ireland border problem with amalgam fillings, because the EU is going faster in abolishing mercury fillings than we are, and that creates an enormous Northern Ireland problem. Who'd have thought it when we were debating Brexit? But because of that, I got to be aware of this really important, really interesting international convention debate that actually had a really good outcome. The world agreed to ban amalgam fillings by 2034, and it was led by the African states. Just a really interesting story. Zero coverage. I wrote a piece for the Yorkshire Bylines about it. So there is so many interesting things happening in the world, and yet we see, you know, journalists running in packs. We see the same stories reported again and again and again. And, you know, there's a magazine, a website called Positive News, and good on them, they're trying. Well done.
Quite a lot of political coverage can be insubstantial, as you said, and some of it can even be quite prejudiced and misogynistic. I've got a couple of examples from the last few months. When the Chancellor Rachel Reeves appeared to be upset in the House of Commons, a Daily Mail article said that she looked hormonal. And Bridget Phillipson, the Education Secretary's haircut was compared to a curtain in a brothel. These kinds of comments, they make absolutely no attempt to engage with the substance of the policy or anything like that at all. It's just about appearance. What kind of impact do you think this reporting is having on our politics?
I think it has enormous impacts, coming back to where I started about talking about people making politics what they do not have done to them. And, you know, the 50-50 Parliament campaign has been doing enormous great work, but we're still a long way from that. And one of the things that really horrifies me when I look around the Houses of Parliament is actually how the gender balance of the staffers. Now, most of the staffers are, you know, young first or second jobbers, very low paid, very keen to get into politics. And I've never seen any stats on this, but I've got no doubt they are hugely biased. And, you know, politics is like, when I talk to a young woman who's talking about getting into politics, you know, I've got a whole little lecture that goes, right, what you do is you imagine you have a mask in front of your face. And when people throw things at you, it hits the mask and it doesn't hit you. Now, that's true to some degree of all genders, but it's so particularly overwhelmingly true, and it discourages so many people from getting involved in politics. And it also just wears people down. And so, you know, we've seen so many, you know, the stats are that women stay in politics after they've been elected as MPs much shorter periods of time than men. And, you know, that kind of stuff just gets wearing. Just thinking about, oh God, you know, what's the media going to say about what I'm wearing today? How do I think about this? Might I get attacked? What can I do to stop being attacked? You know, I'm sorry, but, you know, I don't think it's very difficult for blokes. You know, choosing your tie seems a lot simpler to me.
Thank you, Natalie, and I'll come back to you in a minute if that's okay. So Vince, the professional political media now competes with the sort of Wild West world of social media. Do you think there's a risk that people getting their news from social media is ultimately going to make professional political media obsolete, or do you actually see this as an opportunity for professional media to sort of distinguish itself against that Wild West?
Well, but you know, both are part of reality. I think when you're talking about social media issues, we've got to distinguish between content and platform. I mean, everybody can see there's an issue when Mr. Musk appears and calls for the overthrow of the British government. I mean, that was very, very serious. That's one individual with a particular platform abusing it on a mega scale, and apparently we have no counter to it. But there's a somewhat different issue, which is that the main news platforms, which I think in descending order of magnitude, the BBC, Google, and Meta, I mean, they're in principle neutral. I mean, they have an obvious political agenda beyond making money and keeping in with President Trump. But what is relevant there is whether they themselves provide media plurality in their various outlets. So I think, you know, we need to distinguish those two sets of problems. Neither of them disqualify traditional media. And I think if you look at what's happened in the digital space since 2000, I think the daily readership of the print press has gone from, I think, 21 million to 7. But at the same time, all of those three big outlets, which are DMG, the Mail, the Murdochs, and Reach, have compensated with digital news, right? So, you know, the print press and the new digital press have effectively, you know, worked together. So, you know, the skills you need in one are translated the other. I mean, where it's become a very serious problem is with local newspapers, which have effectively been extinguished, and you've lost all the skill base and the, you know, freedom of expression at a local level. That's where it's been much more serious than at an act.
And thinking about some of your time in frontline politics, could you describe some of the communications challenges you faced when dealing with the media in your role as a cabinet minister?
Well, actually, as a cabinet minister, it's very easy to get media coverage. Sometimes the problem is how to avoid it. So, I mean, what struck me was the enormous difference between, you know, being a cabinet minister, you want to say something, your press office rings up the BBC, the Sky, ITV, you know, they're round at your office in half an hour. You have maximum output. And I contrast this with being a party leader for 2 years. We had 13 MPs. We were, you know, arguably leading the anti-Brexit campaign. We had a consistent, one of the, you know, the leading party that had a consistent approach. But could you get into the media? No. And the argument always was, well, you don't have enough MPs. You know, we're obliged by our rules to allocate time depending on how many MPs you've got. That principle seems to have been suspended now with Mr. Farage, but nonetheless, that was the way it operated. But I have no complaints as a cabinet minister in terms of, I mean, I had my particular horror story with dealing with the Murdochs, which some of you were familiar with, but that was a very particular episode to do with regulation. that wasn't to do with my expressing a point of view. And I, in terms of my ability to communicate as a minister, I have no problems, no complaints.
But I just wonder, thinking back to something Natalie said earlier about sort of political reporting becoming a bit of a kind of about gossip really more than actual substance. I imagine there was quite a lot of that around the differences within the coalition, perhaps. After reading the Democrats.
Yeah, but I mean, there's always a plot. People are always backstabbing. The leadership is always threatened by manoeuvres and a coup. I mean, this is Westminster bubble nonsense, and the political coverage tends to reflect it. I mean, if you're swimming in that particular sea, you have to learn to adapt.
I think sort of touching on something you were talking about earlier with kind of the rise of digital media and so on. So we've now got this very fractured regulatory landscape where social media platforms are ultimately subject to a form of independent oversight from Ofcom. It's a very weak form. I think most of us would agree. Print and online media, which are often the same publishers, they're essentially not really subject to any compulsory independent regulation anyway. And then broadcasters have got their direct accountability to Ofcom. Is there a case for finding a way to kind of unifying accountability for these different platforms?
Well, whether it's unification or finding a common set of rules, it doesn't really matter to me, but there has to be some consistency. I mean, a good example is the fit person rule, which applies to broadcasters but doesn't apply to others. Social media would not be subject to it. And similarly, the plurality rules are very specific, applied to newspapers and television, don't apply to the emerging new media. And, one has to get those two things pulled together. I mean, the one thing that, of course, makes this extremely difficult is the fact that we have lost a great deal of technological sovereignty. I mean, I don't know how many people in the audience looked at the terms of agreement that the government signed with the Trump administration around tariffs. But there was, most of it was trade policy stuff, but there was a clause inserted that any taxation or regulation US tech companies had to be approved by the US administration in the UK. And that obviously enormously circumscribes what any government can do on these major platforms. So we can argue for consistency, but if the government doesn't have effective sovereignty, then not much you can do about it.
As I think you alluded to earlier, you weren't a friend of Murdoch while in power, but I think some of your colleagues, certainly among your coalition partners, did spend a lot of time having private meetings with representatives of the Murdoch publishing empire and other newspaper owners and executives as well. And then there's this constant kind of revolving door of people who have kind of comms jobs in the government and people who have senior roles with News UK and others. Do you think that's healthy for our democracy?
I think the basic principle is that transparency is the best disinfectant. Right? You're going to meet with people either overtly in your office or covertly at the back of a pub, right? It's best to have a system where, you certainly in my job, I was meeting businesses all the time, some of them occasionally media, but mostly other things. And that's part of the job. And you're trying to understand their position and they set out their case. And that seems to be perfectly reasonable and part of a democratic system, providing I disclose it and providing people in Parliament or through a freedom of information can establish who I met and when I met. In the particular case you allude to, I don't want to elaborate too much, but I mean, the story was, as many of you know, that I privately expressed views about this particular news call. But many of my colleagues had numerous meetings, of which their opinions were very obvious. But they nonetheless kept on the right side of these people. And I did. But no, to go back to the basic point, I think meeting people is not a problem, providing it's done openly and is disclosed.
Natalie, you had a thought?
I just wanted to reflect on that. I mean, I agree that transparency is absolutely vital. But what I would add is, and you know, this is a tip to any journalists in the room, is something to have a look at, is we really should be hoping that our politicians, particularly those in government, are meeting with a balanced range of people. And, you know, this is obvious when we think recently, for example, planning an infrastructure bill, you know, meetings with developers, meetings with people who want to build stuff, but where's the meetings with the other side? And we should be demanding, we should be asking for a balance. You know, when those lists of meetings come out, look at the balance and say, why is the balance like this? I mean, we all know the answer, but why not push on that, please?
Finally, I've got to ask you about the BBC resignations. I'm sure everybody's familiar with this story, but Director General Tim Davey and Head of News Deborah Turner Smith resigned from their roles with the BBC following publication of this memo, referring to a few things, but in particular, Panorama's editing of a Trump speech. While this was going on, there was quite an aggressive campaign against the BBC leadership from some newspapers. I just wondered if you had any thoughts on how that played out. Firstly, Sabin's, and particularly kind of the role of the press, and also the president in that saga.
Well, I don't know any more than anybody else in the room, but who said what to whom, and you know, who was the producer, who did this screw up, and who does what on the BBC board. I mean, the details are gossiped about. I don't know any lies. I mean, but this is very, very dangerous because Trump has made it very clear that he uses his very considerable powers and his very considerable wealth to destroy vindictively people who have spoken or acted against him. And I suspect that a lot depends on what the BBC do in the next few days and what their lawyers advise them to do. But I'm rather tempted by the idea that you know, if they simply offered him £1 in compensation and invited the obvious retaliation and take them on, because his grounds don't seem to be very substantial. I mean, clearly there was an element of dishonesty maybe in what the producers did, but in the wider context, it didn't strike me as being the basis of a major defamation case. I'm not a lawyer, but and that if they stood their ground, they could possibly win. But the risks are enormous, clearly. I mean, if Trump were to win a legal case of this kind, I mean, it would destroy the organisation. And I'm not even sure that the British government would be willing to stand behind them. I mean, we've adopted such a passive role in our relationship to the Trump administration. The phrase, the vassal state, I'm afraid, comes back. And I'm not sure that the BBC would get the backing they needed to, but I would be tempted to take them on.
I'd be interested in your thoughts on that, Natalie, but on a specific aspect as well, as a journalist by trade, on this feature of the story, which is that after the resignations had come in, President Trump issued this tweet that specifically thanked the Telegraph newspaper. Now, it seems, I mean, someone said, you know, politicians and the press should be like lamppost and dog. Earlier, it seems that sort of response to receiving a pat on the head from the most powerful politician in the world would be to shove it. But instead, the Telegraph did an article reveling in it, and their editor sent a message out to subscribers noting Trump's support for their reporting and so on. Telegraph could have shot back with an editorial saying, well, we did it, but not for you, mate. You tried to silence journalists in your country. You've had all these attacks on free speech. And they did the opposite. They said, thank you very much, Mr. Trump. I wondered what your thoughts were on that, specifically as a journalist, but also on the story.
I think you're talking about journalism of 40 years ago, the journalism I started out with Barry Clark. We all know journalism doesn't look anything like that these days. And I think what media other than the Telegraph really didn't do an adequate job of doing was explaining. People were just uncritically using the word dossier, like this was some official form of document. It was someone who happened to work to the BBC, who worked with the BBC and left, and then wrote his thoughts on a bit of paper. You know, it wasn't quite in green ink, but it could have been. And one of the other things when I looked into the detail of the dossier, one other part of the dossier said, well, why isn't the BBC doing its reporting about Trump exactly like it's doing this exactly the same thing to Kamala Harris? It's like, that's, you know, because Trump is a very different character and you might be asking different questions. And so the bias in the sources, I'm afraid I'm not surprised by the Telegraph at all. But I do think I'm disappointed in some of the other coverage. And I have to say also, just on the reaction point, I mean, I was very interested listening to the previous panel, who basically came up with the same conclusion that people may know David Allen Green, his Substack. He drafted a letter today, more or less saying what the previous panel said. And thinking about for the BBC going forward, I think it's really important to focus on that this is actually a big international issue. We think about the BBC as our BBC and what we see here, but around the world, BBC World Service really matters. And the BBC, if they feel they are forced to, if they do kowtow to Trump, that is going to have real global, real world consequences about how the BBC is regarded globally for decades. And that's something that I very much hope someone is thinking about very hard.
Just a mischievous addendum, really. When you talked about Trump being the most powerful politician in the world, he almost said he isn't. Xi Jinping probably is, and he would have a more direct way of dealing with this problem. Sweet people.
Okay, does anybody from the audience have any questions for our panel? Up at the back, yes.
I don't think I need a mic. I think on the topic of political reporting, shifting from focusing on substantive political issues and towards scandals and political infighting. I mean, to what extent do you feel like that's the politicians themselves are to blame for that? So the previous government was described as having sort of like a leaking culture. You have politicians having increasingly aggressive PR strategies, like briefing against each other. To me, it seems like they're partly to blame for that shift of, the press no longer being a watchdog, but like a mouthpiece.
So I think the question refers to what extent do politicians themselves fuel some of this kind of insubstantial, gossipy kind of political culture that we've got.
Yeah, but that's politics. I mean, I was a non-politician when I started, and I've gone back to being a non-politician. And 20 years in the Westminster bubble, of course there's gossip, and of course there's competition for power. I mean, that's going back to the Roman Empire or Athens. I mean, this is not new. I mean, quibbling about gossip in politics seems to be a rather pointless policy.
Natalie?
I think my challenge to that claim would be I spent about 12 years trying to get any sort of mainstream media source to do something about home insulation and the fact that the UK has the leakiest homes in Western Europe. And at one point a few years ago, we had the second worst rate in Europe of fuel poverty. This is a big, enormous social issue. Try to get any mainstream coverage of that issue, and it was wholly impossible. The one thing that I finally did this on was on LBC. They rang me up, and it was after Insulate Britain had blocked the M25. And the second morning, they rang me up and said, "Do you want to do the 8 o'clock slot?" And I was very puzzled as an old journalist, old newspaper editor. Why are you putting a second day story on at 8 o'clock? And I found out why, because the Insulate Britain for the second day blocked another bit of the M25, or at least a slip road. And it just so happened that the LBC reporter was on the spot before even the television, before even the police were, before anyone else was. And then they got to talk to me live. So one of the things, how do you get attention to a serious issue? You have to do something pretty radical before you can get the media to cover a serious issue like home insulation.
Just add, if I might, Eamon Powell wasn't my favourite politician, but he had a particularly effective comment on all this, which is when politicians complain about the media, this is like fishermen complaining about the sea. I think that somebody's on.
Yes, here at in the orange shirt here.
Yeah. Thank you. Around 4 years ago, there was no political party in Parliament that opposed climate action. 4 years ago, support for right-wing parties was around 3%. I would argue now Reform and that the Tories, which have moved radically to the far right, now have combined support around 50%. What role do you think the media has actually, sorry, they do have around 50%, Reform and Tories together, around 45, 50% regularly in the polls. And so, I don't know, I'd nodding your head on that one. So what role do you think the media has played in that extraordinarily dangerous position I think we're now facing? I think that it's we're facing a really dangerous moment in British history. We're on the edge of a possible authoritarian government.
And can we hear from Gia in your row as well before we take those two together?
Thank you. This has been a fantastic and very interesting panel so far. I'm from Impress, the UK's only independent press regulator. So I was very interested and appreciative of your comments around regulation. We have the largest network of independent publishers in the UK. However, of course, the mainstream media sit outside. And we are thinking much more about social media platforms, influencers, content creators, especially in this context of rising misinformation. So I was interested in hearing from you both. Do you think that our current regulation is obsolete? What could be taken from what we have right now, and what would you like to introduce for us as regulators to improve the situation?
Natalie, the rise of Reform and the Tories, what's the role of the press in that?
I think I'm always of the view that the press reflects the public. It doesn't significantly change the public. So I don't think, we can all go back to headlines like the Sun what won it, which I think is simply not true. Here I would blame the politicians. We have a political system that's simply not working, that people are extremely frustrated, extremely fed up, and they're looking for alternatives. And if we look to the Brexit referendum, the slogan that won it was "Take back control." There was a percentage of people who were voting Brexit for racist reasons, but mostly it was people who were just enormously frustrated and wanted to give the system a good kicking and shake it up and see what happened. And that's where we are now, is people are looking for alternatives. And that's not being created by the media. That is the reality of people's lives. I think that looking around the sort of demographics of this room, I bet there'll be plenty of people who know someone who's done a degree, got the debt, done a master's and got the debt, trying to find a job. And there's just nothing there. And they can't, if they do find a job in London, they can't even afford to rent a room. All of those things, media didn't create any of those things. It was a political system that has profoundly failed. And we've had 40 years of neoliberalism, neo-Thatcherism, call it what you like. That's what got us to where we are now. And one of my favourite things is I quite often run into sort of old mainstream social democrats in European terms. People who think that, well, everything was fine in the 1990s. And if people just stopped, if they didn't have Russian bots leading them astray, we could just go back to the 1990s. But where we are now is a product of that politics, of those policies, of the politicians of the 1990s. It's not the media's fault.
You said, the Sun, we're past the days of the Sun what is. I think one of the problems might be that this government very much still believes that the Sun can win it. And that seems to be informing its policy on a few things. So Vince, on this question about what more regulators can do, I'd be interested in your thoughts on that, not just in terms of raising standards and so on, but also restoring trust to journalism, which are now, I think the UK is the least trusted country in the G7 on the press. and one of the least trusted in Europe. What can regulators do about that?
Well, if you're talking about trust, I mean, there is a partly relates to the last question, actually. There is something called an Edelman Trust Indicator. I don't know how many people follow it, but it's an attempt to measure internationally how far people trust their institutions, which, you know, the politics, the law, the press, and what's emerged in the last few years is that Western democracies across the board, not just in the UK, languish at the bottom. France is very much the bottom. The UK, Germany, the US are not much better. And the two countries at the top, the most trusted, are Saudi Arabia and China. And actually, the conclusions that they've drawn digging into this is not that, you know, people are not free to express their disquiet in those countries, but it has a lot to do with economic expectations. I mean, I don't interpret modern history quite the way that Natalie does, but nonetheless, the combination of the financial crisis, Brexit, COVID, and the Ukraine war, and energy shocks, you know, have really knocked stuffing out of Western democracies' economies. Living standards haven't risen, and for 2 decades or more, not just here. Britain's a fairly middle of the road country in terms of experience. And it's had a knock-on effect, in contrast to countries where people expect their standard of life to improve from one generation to the next. And that seems to be a better explanation than, you know, manipulation by regulators, whatever. But in terms of what one can actually do, I mean, we discussed earlier the importance of having consistency between traditional media and social media. I mean, nobody has yet mentioned the Online Safety Act. I mean, we do have, you know, an element of a safety net for particular forms of abuse, and certainly I would like to see it used more actively. I mean, I think one of the main negatives that's come out of Brexit is that we did lose the European Commission's increasingly sophisticated regulatory system that wasn't afraid to take on the big American tech companies and find them. And it was clunky. I mean, the European Union bureaucracy is very slow, as we know, but they were using their muscle and they were aiming at the right people.
If I can just come back to that, I'm going to apologise to the questioner, but I don't believe that the regulators, the pace at which technology and media forms are moving now, I don't think the regulators will ever keep up. I think the only successful approach to this would be to look at education and giving people the tools to critically assess what's being presented to them. That's got to be the foundation of this. And, you know, Finland famously, like, as in many areas, has the best education in this. They have very good critical education in their schools and with the public about critically assessing media. And it's my pet thing going on in the House of Lords about quite often. But we have a fundamental problem in trying to bring that in that comes back to what I was talking before about education policy. We have a huge system that teaches to the test, that tells people, right, the 10 things you've got to say in this exam to get an A star are this. And then, right, children, put your books away, and now we're having a critical thinking lesson, and now ask questions. You know, we have a real problem. There's a real structural problem there with our education system that we've really got to tackle to equip our population to deal with the media landscape they're going to face.
Thank you. Just thinking about that question, I do feel compelled to let everyone know that we did aim for a Conservative person to be on this panel as well. We asked literally over 200 representatives of the Conservative Party, and no one was able to do it, unfortunately, but we are a non-partisan party. I think we've got time for one more question. Yes, Graham.
Thanks. This is a question for Sir Vince. Do you think the Labour government have gone back on press reform because they fear the press or they love the press? Which one is it?
Do you think the Labour government have broken their promises on press reform because they fear the press or because they love the press?
Well, it's clearly the former. Yeah, and I think it's one of the many areas that they came into government chronically underprepared. I mean, it's true in economic policy too. They expected to win, but they haven't begun to think through the problem of government. I mean, unlike Trump 2, where you had a host of people preparing a raft of legislation to go with from day one, the Labour people seem to have come into government absolutely and completely unprepared. No idea what government involved, making things up as they went along. I wouldn't single this issue out. I mean, it's one of a dozen, 20 things which they're only just getting around to thinking about. So your question's a bit loaded. I think it's a general lack of organisation and clarity and such.
Natalie?
Yeah, I have to entirely agree with Sir Vince on that. So it's good to get to that point at the end of the panel. I mean, I've heard from civil servants, basically new ministers walking into the room and going, right, what are we going to do? And the civil servants going, you're supposed to tell us what to do, and then we work out how to do it. And I mean, there is a real lesson here. If you win an election by trying very hard not to say anything at all, except we're not those people over there, if you don't stand for something, if you don't tell the people we're here and we're going to do X, Y, and Z, and you don't even let that be done in secret because it might leak, then it's practically impossible to govern. And there is a real lesson there, I think.
Excellent. Well, thank you both very much for speaking today so interestingly and insightfully. A round of applause, please. We now have 15 minutes for a very quick tea and coffee break. So please do be as quick as you can without burning yourselves. I'll be back here in 15 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. So yes, so vote, lobby, proportional representation, regulate the press. Yeah, I think with the conclusions I've taken from that. Thank you so much, everybody. We're gonna move on to the next panel now, but that was really interesting, and we can continue the conversations later on. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Emma and panel. As Evan and his panelists move up now to take their seats for our final one. As I mentioned earlier, Press Justice Project is the charity, the campaigning organisation that's better known as Hacked Off. And of course, Hacked Off drew its name as a pun on the phone hacking, which gave rise to so much concern about press behaviour. And of course, the drama, The Hack, which has just recently concluded, really put a spotlight on the sort of behaviour that the press has engaged in over the years, and some suspect is still engaging in. And The Hack, of course, followed the golden rules of TV drama, in that it included both David Tennant and Toby Jones. But of course, it was broadcast on ITVX, and as many of you will see, there's currently a bid by Sky to take over ITV, and obviously to take over the broadcasting bit of ITV, not the production bit. But reflecting on Donnachadh's last point on the panel just now, talking about media ownership, actually things are still going in the wrong direction. We're now looking possibly at a further degree of concentration if Sky, no longer controlled by Manor, of course, but previously controlled by Manor, and it would raise the question as to whether dramas like The Hack would continue to get commissioned and broadcast under a new, even more concentrated media landscape in the UK. So with that, I'd like to hand over to Evan to introduce himself and his panel, and this final panel, after which we'll all be meeting for drinks. So Evan, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you very much. Very kind of you to have me here and have this panel. And thank you all for staying. I know you're all staying for this, not for anything that follows. What this is a discussion not only of, but prompted by the ITV series The Hack. Now, not everyone will have seen it. Can anyone indicate if they haven't seen it? So I haven't seen it, so I don't want any spoilers. Whether it turned out that there was phone hacking, or we're going to try and steer around that. But what it will do, because we've got three important players in the legal side of it and the journalistic side of it and the investigative side of that investigation, we will have some reflections on what was there. I looked for reviews of the hack in the Mail and the Mirror and the Sun, and that didn't seem to exist. So I'm not even sure it was broadcast. The Mirror didn't think much of it. It did mention it. So I want to introduce the panel, and then we'll have an initial chat about some of the things. And you'll see the biographies in the programme. I never read out the biographies, but I would point out that other than me, all these photographs are realistic. That's the only one that's dated, I think, as you can see. I first met Charlotte when I think she was holding a cocktail in a pub, probably, and in around 2008, during a meeting of the libel reform campaign in Parliament, which actually Paul Fowley was involved in as well. And she was working for a defendant, in fact, of a libel claim, and I became involved in a campaign to make our libel laws more defendant friendly, which some people hacked off have never forgiven me for, and indeed a number of lawyers who act for claimants, no names, Aaron, have never forgiven me for. But since then, she was just a whirlwind of activity at that point, and since then she has been one of the most energetic proponents of the rights of people who are victims of the press to get justice, and has been one of the most eloquent spokespeople for the claimant side of these matters, and has forged a career for herself as well, and now heads up the relevant department at Brown Rudnick. Paul I met, I think, first with a pint in his hand. Doesn't really narrow it down, to be fair, but at the parliamentary rugby all-party group where we were debating, which he was a leading, he was and probably was for a long time afterwards, still the captain. And I, as you can tell from me, I'm strictly an armchair fan of the game. My sport is chess, far more injury-free from that. And but I first met him through drinking, in my case, a shandy at that event, and then he was involved in exposing the super injunction. Actually, one of the only few super injunctions, if you know what the definition of a super injunction is, that existed around the Trafigura case, and improving the way that that's been handled, and exposing that in Parliament. But he was also the long-standing member, probably the ever-present, of the Culture, Media and Sports Committee through all its inquiries into phone hacking, which didn't just, and unlawful information gathering by the press, which didn't just start in 2011. They were on this in 2003, in 2006, 7, 8, 9, 10, and he was relentless in his pursuit, having been a journalist, and it's the people who were journalists, we know many of them in this room, who could see just how corrupt the practice had become, and what a disgrace it was to journalism. Ellen I first met with a gin and a tin.
Oh my God.
Anyway, garden. I suppose I have to be fair, given this litigation possible. This was during lockdown, and the only time you could meet for a drink, the only place was in one of the narrow roads outside a supermarket off the garden. And I think it was me that had the gin and tin. She I think just had a bottle of sparkling water. And Ellen was involved when I met her at Hamlin's, working on the phone hacking litigation. But at the time that this story is set, I think she was in opera, which is not Opera Winfrey, I think, but like proper opera, running or helping to run the English National Opera and his musical. And she's agreed as in lieu of a fee for this to perform some of her musical talents, which involve, I think, the violin and elite violin playing. But anyway, that gives some of the history of these characters, and they are characters that can talk about this. You've seen my biography. I got involved in this through libel reform, and then found myself out of a job in 2010, and was recruited by Hacktoff to do some work on the hacking inquiry that then pursued. And I met Nick Davis early on, and so I know a lot of what happened. A lot of the characters, most of the characters in the drama, but since I haven't seen it, I can't protest too much about how unrealistic it is. Although I don't think character Harris was featured in it, which is outrageous. So what I'd like to do is first ask Charlotte whether when did you realise, because you were involved in this quite early on, and you can explain how extensive what Nick Davis, I think, had told you at the time was going on. I think you were, I don't want to break any confidential journalistic sources, but I know you were in touch with him in the early days, in the late 2000s.
Nick Davis.
Hold the...
Oh, like that. Okay. Hello. Nick Davis wrote the book Flat Earth News, and somebody who really hasn't had, I think, as much credit in the phone hacking at all. Jeremy Reed, who's was the barrister on the first phone hacking claims, read Flat Earth News, and then he told us all about it. And it was actually Jeremy Reed who said, there's this guy, Nick Davis, who's onto this. So what had actually happened was that the legal teams were already working on these cases. And that's right, in terms of how the hack, for those of you who have watched it, and I don't think it's a spoiler here, that Nick Davis wrote a book and had these suspicions, and they weren't really just suspicions from a journalistic point of view. He had that perception and his own sources, but at the same time, parallel to that, the news of the world had so much power at the time, but were publishing so frequently and actually without enough care, arrogantly, the spoils of their illegal interception. And those two worlds collided. But from my point of view anyway, when Jeremy Reed said, read this book, I don't think it was just, the teams who are working on the phone hacking cases who he told about it, but he really felt he was, that it was resonating with the kind of cases, which at that time weren't cases about interception. They were cases about early privacy and defamation. So we were in a world where day after day after day, these articles were being published. Articles are kind of different in nature and tone than we have now. And so we were always talking to the news of the world, to the Sun, to the Mail. So you would have file after file after file. And then suddenly this explanation, in this book started to appear. And Nick Davis was obviously extremely interested in, what cases were being run. So I'd say year-wise, it's funny because I tried to remind myself of when it was, because to me it's earlier. I see it as kind of 2007, 8, 9. We were working together on these cases, me and Rachel, at George Davies. So
in 2007, of course, there was the sentencing hearing for Mulcair and Goodman, and it was identified that there were non-royal victims who had been who were involved in the case, and a number of people, I suspect Charlotte among them, couldn't work out why it was one rogue royal reporter who was reporting on the likes of,
Well, it was
Liberal Democrat royalty, Simon Hughes, but not royalty by anyone else's.
it was the categories of that really stood out. So I think we're all familiar with the breakthrough in terms of public awareness, which was, of course, Millie Dowler. But before then, the categories that were given as examples by the Justice Gross.
Boss.
No, I'm talking about the not Voss. I'm talking about the criminalists. I think I might got that wrong. But it certainly wasn't Voss, he was later. But the criminal judge in it said there were sports agents. So he mentioned Sky Andrew, one of the first publicists. That's Max Clifford. People know that he took the early case. The model and businesswoman, McPherson. And Simon Hughes, of course, Lib Dem royalty. Gordon Taylor, who was PFA. What they didn't say and what was missing, and this is the infuriating thing, was and ordinary people and victims of crime. And that was the difference. So even though that came out and made us think, okay, well, one rogue reporter and yet all of these categories, and sort of desperately trying to get this information about what, how widespread it was. Even then, for those few years, it still seemed to be at a level of public eye. So the big shocker later was the spread of ordinary people.
Thank you. We'll come on to that. Paul, if I can ask you to reflect on your, what you were finding out in your time on the select committee, up to the Millie Dowler thing. Let's not go beyond that, up to the Millie Dowler thing, because the select committee was certainly onto something and didn't believe what they were being told. Is that right? By the News International.
Yeah. Is this working? Yes.
Yeah.
Actually, Tom McNally was just got my neurons firing in the previous panel, because I was on the 2002 Ofcom committee, the Putnam committee, with him. I was a spring chicken, age of 40, and we had a lot of fun resisting pressure from the government, who were trying to bend the will of the committee at the behest of the press. And in fact, it actually took a couple of years for them to put me on another committee with you, actually, the Science and Technology Committee, where they thought I couldn't get up to any more mischief. And I was only 3 years into Parliament. With phone hacking, I mean, we touched on it in after 2005, but after that we did two big investigations into phone hacking. And my motivation in pressing for those was quite simple. Before Parliament, I was an old-fashioned investigative journalist at The Observer, and I thought these people had just brought shame on my profession. So our first inquiry, which was 2010, demolished the one row reporter defence, and I was assisted in that in Evans by Evans' predecessor at Hacked Off, one of the founding directors, Brian Cathcart, whom I got onto the committee as a special advisor, because we knew how newsrooms work and deadlines worked, and how people like how the reporters would work, and we could recreate their steps, and just forensically delve into what had been revealed in court to say, actually, we just do not believe this. It doesn't stack up. And the second inquiry in 2012 was really focused on how these lying bastards came and lied to us.
How much were you involved prior to 2011? How much did you know about what Nick Davis was doing, and The Guardian, and a few other newspapers? The Independent, to be fair, was doing the odd story as well in 2009. You were across the 2009 story that was...
Yes, what we did in 2009 was we were doing an inquiry into press standards, libel, and then I made sure that we got hacking into that, because it was germane to press standards. And that was why I remember spending one Christmas with Brian Cathcart going over an early draft which wasn't good enough, and we thoroughly redrafted that in the Christmas review, saying, look, the one road reporting defence is an absolute fiction. And at that time, The Guardian was alone, and no editor, even Alan Rusbridger, wants to be alone with the pack after you. And the pack included the Press Complaints Commission, which had castigated the Guardian for its shoddy journalism. So that was an absolute disgrace. And so when that defence was blown open, that was start of the end of the PCC, certainly. But it was important for the Guardian because it was not alone. A select committee, which is there to hold people to account, was willing to delve deeper than usual and actually find in its favour, not because it was partisan, because it was prepared to follow the evidence.
The select committee had voices on that were more press friendly. I mean, I'm not suggesting the chairman, John Whittingdale, I know we both respect, would have any connections to News International that later emerged. But did he accept all your amendments immediately, or did you have to work quite hard to get them through?
Well, one of the features of the select committee is that unless the vote is a tie, the chair never gets the vote. In fact, I deliberately abstained on one thing or another vote to give John his 10 years first vote he never had, something minor. So if you've got a committed committee, it doesn't matter where the chair stands. And of course, John was very friendly with News International, and that our reports led to the rupture of some friendships. And of course, more members from another political party were looking over their shoulders, and you might speculate that some members of the committee were leaking stuff. But if you've got committed members like Tom and other people, I'd say Tom Watson, one great conservative who then went on to lead the committee later on, Damien Collins. If you've got a majority that's willing to follow the evidence, it doesn't, and is persistent, it doesn't really matter if one or two people are looking over their shoulders or doing things that you might raise an eyebrow at. And that's what we did, we followed the evidence.
Thank you, Paul. Ellen, how much of what was going on prior to you getting involved, how much of this were you aware of while you were blowing into your violin or whatever it was you were doing in your orchestra with various High Court judges?
Well, I was very aware of it. I watched the news and was very interested because it was at the time I was doing my law exams and left English National Opera in 2009 to become a trainee solicitor. So it was something that I was very, very interested in. And it's quite surreal sort of, later in life to come back to look in detail at the news stories that were really pertinent to me at that time.
Because you worked at Hamlin's, which became...
Still do, by the way, as far as I'm aware.
You had a desk at Hamlin's, and they later became, taking on over from Bindman's, Tamsin, Alan there, and Mark Thompson at Thompson Heath, the lead solicitor role from about 2016 onwards. So you had to look back and see what you'd kind of missed, as it were.
Yes.
And one of your clients later on was Tom Watson. I don't know how much you can say. Sure, because he said a lot. He's written books about this, so I'm sure you've got some liberty to repeat what he said to us. But part of his claim that you ran was that he was being surveilled, as probably Paul was, while being members of the select committee.
Well, that's right. The allegations, and I've got to qualify everything that I'm saying now, are untested in court allegations, but
we know they're true.
But I'm prevented from referring to documents because of the rules about the use of disclosure. But what I would say is that there was an application made in May by The Guardian, a journalist at The Guardian, who asked for skeleton arguments to be released to the media, and they were, and those allegations are in the public domain. NGN obviously denies all wrongdoing, but the allegations were that Tom was surveilled during the Labour Party conference in 2009, and a private investigator was tasked by a journalist called Mazza Mahmood, and some of may have heard of. And not only that, there were other allegations relating to his what was called a fake security threat in the pleadings relating to an alleged attempt by Tom and Gordon Brown to steal Rebecca Brooks' emails, which was then used as, this was the allegation I'm saying, the justification to destroy millions and millions of emails. Other allegations involved the unlawful information gathering around members of the select committee that was investigating wrongdoing at the News of the World. All of these were denied, by the way.
Well, so millions of emails were deleted, that was admitted, but they said it was because they had this security threat, like that they heard that their bank account had been interfered with, so they went to the safe and burnt their cash. It's a very weird, in my view, excuse, which was never tested. I think it's right to say they haven't denied all wrongdoing, because in the settlement with the Duke of Sussex and your client Tom Watson, they did admit for the first time ever that the Sun had paid private investigators to do unlawful things.
I've actually, I don't know why, but I printed off the apology, and they say NGN offers a full and unequivocal apology to the Duke of Sussex for the serious intrusion by the Sun between 1996 and 2011 into his private life, including incidents of unlawful activities carried out by private investigators working for the Sun.
And it's important that that's remembered.
Can I just say, sorry, just in relation to, as I've got it, because of course I just mentioned that NGN denied all wrongdoing in respect of the surveillance of Tom during the Labour Party conference, and they offered an unequivocal apology to him for the unwarranted intrusion carried out during his time in government by the News of the World during the period 2009 to 2011.
And what's remarkable about that is, of course, if you had to choose two hate figures for News International, at least one's in the public eye, not the likes of us who are not in the public eye, they would be Tom and Harry, and probably there's a Dick out there somewhere as well. We're looking for one, so if anyone knows someone. And so, you know, for them to have to, like chewing on a wasp, I think getting that admission. Charlotte, let's talk about this drama. You were in it. I understand. I'm gonna watch it. So maybe we can watch it again together. But what did you think of it?
I was so glad it was on.
Sorry?
I was so glad that it was on, and I think that's the thing. I knew about it relatively early on. I was in Leeds. It was the day before a trial in Leeds, so it was one of those things where I spoke to the producers, and they phoned up and they said, "Okay, so we're likely to have you as a character. Do you care how you're represented?" So I said, "No, it's fine, whatever." And they said, "Do you mind what gender you are?" "No." Do you mind if you look different? No, whatever you want. You know, you can. You know, I didn't really mind at all, and then. Rose Leslie turns up in a Charlotte wig, which was that was very flattering portrayal. I do feel that for once I'm getting more credit than I deserve in terms of the hack, because what they've really done here for storytelling purposes is they've got a representative lawyer in it, but and I think they've got it right to the extent that at first it was small and then it built up more and more and more. And so I think there's I think that the Charlotte character who's in it now, funnily enough, a lot more like me now, which probably reflects discussions or, that I've had, with them, than like me then. If anything, the legal teams at the time, particularly early, before we all got organised into a claimant group, we were much more of a. I think I'd be forgiven by any of the lawyers who were there right at the start. We were a bit of a haphazard bunch. It was all it all looks on the hack as being sort of quite sort of organised and the lawyers are doing it. But actually, at the time, we'd never done this before. It was all a bit pick up the phone to the News of the World, say something to Tom Crone at the time, and then hide under the table. It's like, we were really feeling around. But the reason why I mentioned Jeremy earlier is because one of the things that doesn't come across in the hack, and why should it? And it doesn't matter to the extent it's a sort of thing that's interesting to people who are sort of into the legals, is how did we actually get a claim going at all? And I think this is a point. The answer is a design of what some people would say the kitchen sink claim. What we would say is an inferential claim. And so there's no admissions. You phone up the police, they tell you to go away. You phone up, News International, they used to say really villainous things like, "I know your game." Okay, right. Who are you? Are you a new kid on the block? These are real quotes. Like, sort of outrageous sort of posturing going on. And the idea of being able to get these disclosures that then built up really did seem impossible, or how to fund. And eventually, what we got to was the inferential claim, where we said, well, we infer this must happen. And that really, I think, was quite a breakthrough in trying to get it off the ground, and then everything followed. But it was a lot of people.
I'm going to ask Paul to give his reflections on the drama, but first I should say the reason I haven't watched it is that I'm involved as part of the legal team in suing the Daily Mail for the same sort of things, and that's been a lot of work over the last month. And I just wanted to say it's still a rabble.
None of the madness of it all behind the scenes has quite come through.
People have no idea.
They don't.
You don't see a swan, but if you did see a swan serenely sailing across the litigation field, there's a frantic motor underneath trying to do the work. Paul, do you have any reflections on it?
I met the ITV team for a long session before it was produced, and I'll preface these remarks by the fact I don't care one jot about being edited out. I much prefer a quiet life. I'm clearly happy that the courage of Nick Davis has made at least the little screen, and that the key role of other journalists like Amelia Hill has not been left out. David Lee, I worked with, Chief of Investigations, I worked with over Trafigura, Alan Rusbridge. The vital role of Max Mosley, sort of mentioned in passing. Charlotte might say more about Max, but underplayed. I was involved, for those people who watched the series, in the other strand of the double helix, the murder of Daniel Morgan, but I know Jackie Hames through Hacked Off and the mill she went through. Let me just make sure I haven't missed any other names. No. And with such a star cast, I don't want to be downbeat. But I thought the hack was a disappointment, really, of a missed opportunity. I think, firstly, interweaving the two stories didn't work. The Daniel Morgan case deserves its own treatment, a Leveson 2 treatment, in terms of the corrupt relationships between the press and the police. And there was enough in the hacking story itself, not least Max Mosley's impetus from the start, that was just missed and glossed over. And one example of that, and I don't want to delve on, I can answer questions, is that the select committee's role became a bit of a pastiche and a parody. Secondly, in part because of that, as it went on, the show turned into a rather double helical soap opera, which largely left the main mystery unsolved as far as I was concerned. There was no portrayal of these people who are in and out of Number 10, arm-twisting secretaries of state all the time. But in particular, amid the soap opera of the Guardian newsroom and Jackie's front room, there was not one single scene showing the animals in the zoo in the News of the World newsroom, and how they used phone hacking as one of many little illegal tricks to make ordinary people's lives a misery and not just celebrities. And I thought that was a pretty disappointing failure on behalf of the team that made Mr. Bates so resonant about the effect on ordinary people. And thirdly, frankly, I was really puzzled about the prominence given to Gordon Brown, terrible acting as well. And those sofa sit-downs involving Nick Davies never happened at number 11. And that's part of the dramatic license that star writers are allowed to use. But in this case, it creates an unintended misimpression, because part of the narrative of News International was there's nothing to see here. This is just Labour politicians trying to get the Murdochs. That was part of that cover-up, and that sort of scene, giving the impression that Nick was being directed in any way, feeds that narrative. So this was an appalling episode, chapter in the history of the UK press that deserved the truth rather than dramatic fictionalisation. I think for a better programme was the one shown on Sunday night, The Hack, the documentary by ITV as well. But it was a shame it was shown in the graveyard slot. The reason for that is part of the ongoing story of the influence of News International on how people deal with the subject of their power.
Thank you. I'll take questions in a minute, so please indicate shortly. But Alan, can I ask you whether because obviously there was all this bad practice, illegal practice going on in the newsroom, but some of us feel that the worst thing about it was the cover-up, which is perverting the course of justice and subverting the police and the authorities. Did that come up? I haven't seen it, so I will, maybe Christmas. But did that come across, or was it all about the hacking and the investigation of the hacking?
I'll answer that in a second. I just want to agree really with what Paul had to say about the how those two stories didn't really interweave successfully from my point of view, and how I think there was a real lost opportunity to focus, picking up on what Charlotte said earlier, to focus on the victims, who were ordinary people by and large. There was one reference to celebrity, really, to Sienna Miller, that sort of, but there are so many, as we've seen in the hacking litigation, there are so many victims of phone hacking who are ordinary victims of crime and have no real recourse to take on these huge media organisations who've exploited their positions to really to obtain information unlawfully and rather than carrying out legitimate journalism, as we all really hope that we're going to get. Was there concealment of and did it come across in the programme? Not really. I think that the period of time that the programme covered didn't really cover the later uncovering of the extent of the concealment and the extent of the wrongdoing that we've seen.
One Rogue Reporter started pretty much in 2006-07,
yeah, and
was the narrative that was exploded by Millie Dowler.
Well, there was reference to those three, well, what we call the three incriminating emails that were discovered, I think on the 6th of January 2011, that a news group found them, then handed them over inexplicably to the police 3 weeks later. And then that kicked off Operation Wheating. There was reference, but I don't think that was.
What were they doing in those 3 weeks?
Well, there was this allegation made that Tom Watson and Gordon Brown had conspired to steal Rebecca Brooks' emails 2 days before Operation Wheating was kicked off. Right. 3 weeks after these incriminating emails were discovered.
I only found out in 2022 that they hacked my phone, and I thought, how stupid can you be, hacking MPs who are investigating me for hacking? And it didn't just go on until the closure of the News of the World, which was the implication of the programme. So it not only missed the cover-up, but they were still hacking while the Murdochs were coming in front of us and saying this is the most humble day of my life. They were still hacking during the Leveson inquiry. And if the News of the World had closed, then if not the Sun, who? It was the corporate intelligence, is the suspicion. None of this was delved into the programme, by the programme. Thank you.
So there's still a programme to be made if there's anybody devices out there. Can I see if anyone wants to ask a question of anyone? And if I can take two at a time. So there's a gentleman with big hair at the back.
That was the Barney.
Oh, sorry, Steve.
I want to pick up exactly that point on the inadequacy of showing exactly what was going on in newsrooms and why. And maybe the two lawyers can answer the question. Were ITV afraid of libel suits? Were they afraid of Murdoch? And do we know whether it's true, as someone suggested to me, that a script was actually sent to NGN for comment, and they therefore would have had to take account of whatever response they then got from Newsgroup?
Thank you. And if you come forward, Nathan, to the gentleman at the front here with not so big hair.
Hello. Yeah, that's why I'm co-founder of Evening Revision. Thanks to EJB for putting this fascinating evening on. So my question actually primarily is for Paul. And I would be interested in your views on this as well. You're all very experienced and also you think about the press a lot. For me, excuse me, there are lots of stars at the top here. And yes, whilst I'm absolutely certain we need media regulation, I think it's more important that we have media ownership regulation. And I would also, we have seen in the past the previous Labour Party leaders bring media ownership regulation to the table. Unfortunately, they got destroyed partly because of that. But their idea was it was Corbyn actually, and his idea was to change the ownership level so that you had to be a British national. So you had to have a British passport. You couldn't be offshore. You couldn't be have a foreigner basically to buy own the press. Do you think that policy would work now? And if not, what policy would work? Bearing in fact it has to be this Parliament that acts it.
So if the microphone needs to come to this one.
I'll keep an eye on. Oh, it does. You've got your mic.
Anyone?
Anybody ready?
So the first question is Steve's question up front, and you won't know the specifics, so that I've got some idea. And if you did, you might not want to talk about it. But is it normal for a drama to provide a front up to someone featuring in it?
I think the answer is yes. And I think that in terms of this particular production, I can just speak from my own experience of having spoken to the ITV producers and actually the documentary producers. There was quite a surprising nervousness in atmosphere, even to the extent of you could still feel it on the day they did a preview of it. Lots of people turned up to that, and that was quite nice, really, to see some of the old gang there. Saw you there, Paul, obviously, and Alan Rusbridger was there, and that Amelia Hill was there. But actually, I think that I understand the criticisms that you've made of it, and of course they're right. But I have a kind of slightly different view on it. So it's not, it sort of goes above the programme, and I think it maybe comes and maybe it reflects on Steve's question, which is this: they were nervous about it. They did do it from the point of view of the journalistic. The journalistic bravery. They didn't cover everything, but there ought to be more productions about this. And that what's interesting is how we say it's a missed opportunity. It should not be the only opportunity. We shouldn't have only one chance to capture this story, and then it's now. That's how they perceived it, and younger people watching it who've fed back to me don't understand necessarily, or quite what was don't understand quite what
sales are.
no, well, exactly. That was one of the things that would have helped if there'd been a bit more demonstration of that, but also empathy in terms of how we see our own privacy and how we protect our privacy. That's kind of changes. It all looked a bit rudimentary. Do I know that there would have been, any scripting that would have gone to News International? The answer is I do not know that, but I do know that some scripting came to me. And so one of the things that they were careful about was fact checking, and there were some facts that weren't quite right, but my view on it was, like, for instance, 3 applications to get some disclosure out, not me walking across a bridge and telling Nick Davis. Like, very nice. But from a storytelling point of view, that's important just to get the story across.
Ellen, do you have anything to add to that from your experience?
Very briefly, I don't know the answer as to whether Newsgroup read the script or was provided the opportunity to comment on it, but I do know in my experience that Newsgroup is completely on everything that is critical of them as an organisation, and I would be very surprised personally if they didn't see it and they didn't exert pressure on a company like ITV, and that also calls into question how ordinary people are able to bring big media organisations to account when ITV is plainly nervous.
I mean, certainly I can say, Steve, that I was involved in a programme called Scandalous, which is not about my scandals, but was about the Newsgroup litigation. And I know that there was a 50-page response to the front up that came from News International that they had to wade through. So they are extremely well resourced to do that in a way that ordinary people don't get the same right to defend themselves from proposed publication to millions by these newspapers. Paul, can I just briefly, because I know we've got to go. I don't want to get into the issue of media ownership because that was dealt with to a degree earlier, and I think there's probably a whole PJP conference to be had on that. But to what extent were the proprietors of News International portrayed in the drama? Carefully, I assume.
Well, I remember, maybe we can repeat it. I remember we'd spent a long time on the committee trying to invite politely Rupert Murdoch, James Murdoch, and Rebecca Brooks to appear, but they never said no, but their diaries or their movements or their travel always made it impossible for them. But subject to that, we were happy to, and they never did appear. But when they came to apologise to the parents of Millie Dowler, I knew they were in the country. So I remember a meeting, and not everyone was there, so I didn't have a majority. A private meeting of the committee, and I asked the clerks, if I move the motion to summons, will the results be made public? And when the clerk said yes, all the reluctant Tories folded. So the men with the tights without their swords, but with all his cards went round to Wapping. And I did that knowing that
the Sergeant at Arms, just to be clear, it's not members of the committee.
So you can't send people to the tower these days to have their eyes pecked out by crows. So they've got to say no. But the Murdochs wouldn't have said no. So they had a respect for democracy, and Rebecca turned up as well. But the way they portrayed in the hack was really overly sympathetic. The documentary is more critical. And it was an act. We got quite a lot out of them actually, but it was an act. And the follow-up, the cover-up, showed how much of an act it was. And then you cannot just not blink and shake your head that a few years later, having been found innocent on very narrowly drawn charges in the criminal trial, that Rebecca Brooks, who's is once again the head and is still the head of the UK operation of News International. So what does that say about the penitence, the humbler state of my life, that actually life, business, and possibly making people's lives miserable goes on because it makes us money?
Thank you very much. Just on that, I mean, it is alleged, and this can't be tested in court because of parliamentary rules, that a lot of what was said to the Select Committee wasn't true, and one might think that the apology that we heard about from the Sun is utterly inconsistent with evidence given at the Leveson inquiry and to the Select Committee that the Sun was, quotes, a clean ship. It wasn't a clean ship. So either the then editor of the Sun at the time, Rebecca Brooks, knew it wasn't a clean ship and didn't say that, said the opposite to these inquiries, or she was so incompetent that she didn't know she had a very dirty ship, and that sort of incompetence can only be punished by re-promotion. So the real, well, that's obvious what was really going on. Anyway, I'm not allowed. I don't really mind about keeping you from drinks, but if I keep Charlotte from a cocktail, Paul from a pint, and Ellen from gin in a tin, and there will be real trouble. So thank you very much to our panel for coming.
Thank you very much. It's funny, I was walking in today, I was actually in the Royal Courts of Justice looking in on a case that we're supporting, and walking back from there, I saw this figure who I was sure I knew, and I was about to greet him, and I realised, no, I don't actually know you at all. I recognise you, though. It was Andy Coulson. So I don't know what's going on today. But Paul, I was very pleased that you mentioned Max Mosley. Because I used to do a lot of work for Formula One, and so for many years I would speak to Max every day. And when he was done over by the Mail on Sunday, as I think it was the Mail, wasn't it? It was News of the World, because I think Staker was involved. But anyway, when he was done over, he called me up and said, I'm going to sue. Can you help me? And I said, well, I can't help you because I'm not a libel lawyer, but I can probably help you find a libel lawyer. But I said, well, as you would always say to a friend and to a client, you will be crazy to sue because you will just give them the excuse to just carry on raking up the story day after day. And Max said to me, he said, no, he said, they've got me wrong with this. He said, because I'm a very wealthy man and they have already said about me the worst thing they can possibly say. So I have nothing to lose. And thinking about some of the remarks Charlotte made and that Ellen made, Ellen talking about, the fact that a lot of the people who are victims of these, and we have to remind ourselves, a lot of the victims are regular citizens. They're not celebrities. They're not public figures. They're not politicians. They're just victims. They're just collateral damage as far as the press is concerned, frankly. But we've only made the progress that we've made, and by that I mean us collectively, everyone who's fighting for a better press system, because of some very brave individuals who also thought they didn't have anything to lose or were willing to take big risks. So people like Tom Watson, people like Hugh Grant, people like Prince Harry, who've led the way and taken these risks on behalf of all of us. And I think what comes out of this is absolutely true. We need desperately to rebalance the relationship between our press and our citizens. And that's what really we at the PJP are trying to do. The PJP is a charity, so we'll all welcome your support, and you'll see around the room people wearing these very attractive lanyards. So if you want to talk to anyone about what the PJP does and how to get in touch with us and how to support us and how to be on our list for future events like this, we've already had some good suggestions. We're open to more suggestions of topics that we should cover with the PJP and Hacked Off. So it remains to me really just to thank again Lewis Silkin for hosting us here. And hopefully somebody will be able to stay on and mingle with the rest of us. It's been lovely to see you. I look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you.